Very nice to be joining such a wonderful gathering of scholars as far away here as the Pacific coast of the United States. I really appreciate the invitation to join you all today and apologize for any internet problems I might have. I'm speaking from my office, which is in a rural area of Washington State near Seattle, Washington, and I do hope that my internet will hold up here. I've really enjoyed what I've been able to watch this morning. The conference started at 2 o'clock in the morning my time here, so I was not able to see everything, watch all the presentations, but I've seen some of the most recent ones, and it's wonderful to be able to reflect on the Great Schism, nearly 1,000 years or a millennium into its history, its sad and tragic history. And I would like to start by commenting, as an Orthodox Christian priest, what a tragedy the schism is. And I think we can all agree that the schism of 1054, that in 2054 we'll be commemorating 30 years from now, is a very tragic episode in the history of Christianity, but also in the history of Western culture. And I would like to speak today about Western culture, about the place of the schism in Western culture, especially a culture that in past years and even centuries has begun to disintegrate and markedly. Some of the presentations I've seen this morning have already brought attention to different aspects of that disintegration, that process. But as I say, this tragedy is something we can learn from, something that we can even perhaps be inspired to reverse. And so I want to start by quoting a Orthodox theologian, well known, arguably the most important Orthodox theologian of the 20th century, and that is George Florovsky. He wrote many works, including works of history. And he used a phrase to characterize the course of that history, a history which is so often fraught with tragedy. He said, yes, history is a tragedy whereby we witness the loss of good things in our civilization and culture. But we as Christians must always remember that history is a creative tragedy. It's a creative tragedy. And so in the books that I've written, a four-part series of books on the history of the rise and fall of what the West once was, whose overall title is Paradise and Utopia, I've quoted Florovsky, and I've tried to show that this process of history that in many ways is determined by or flows out of the Great Schism that we can date to 1054, although everyone here, I think, realizes that 1054 itself is something of a phantom date. There's much more going on than just that one act of excommunication in Constantinople between Rome and the ecumenical patriarch. That the history that flows out of that event is indeed tragic, but it is also creative. And I would like to think that as we approach the millennium of that fateful day in 1054, July 16th, 1054, what might sadly be called Excommunication Day. I don't like the thought of that on the Christian calendar, but that's probably what we can call it for now. That we can look at it as Christians, both from the East and the West, in a creative way. And so what does that mean? And for me, what that means is going back to the deep past, understanding where we are today by looking into that deep past of the first millennium. So many people who comment from a Christian point of view on the disintegration of Western culture today, the cultural crisis we live in, and here living near Seattle, Washington, I can certainly attest that all around is evidence of this cultural crisis. I can talk about all sorts of different events that have happened recently in my own neighborhood here, as it were. if we look back, we can see, and many Christian commentators have done so, many historians from a Christian point of view have done so, various movements or events that have set the history of the West away from its Christian origins. Some of these commentators would point to the sexual revolution, so-called, that began to take a hold in the 1950s and then exploded in the 1960s and then kind of played itself out in the 1970s, a whole generation whereby in a revolutionary way, the sexual values of the West simply were altered radically in a non-Christian way. And we certainly see the evidence of that today, not only in various movements to normalize the sexual revolution, but even culminating, as has been observed, in the transgender phenomenon, where the biological sex of a human being is itself called into question. Other cultural commentators would go further back in history to something like the so-called Enlightenment. I don't like that term as a Christian. I think that the term enlightenment belongs to a Christian sharing of the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ with the world, and not its rejection. And certainly it was rejected. The gospel was rejected and displaced by the secular culture of the 18th century. Enlightenment beginning in the 17th century and then playing itself out in the 19th century in movements like Romanticism, which I think is a fascinating movement in the secularization of the West. But the so-called Enlightenment would be seen as a second key turning point in the history of this disintegration. Other cultural commentators would go even further back in time to the Protestant Reformation, which of course affected the West, not really the East immediately and directly, that is to say, Eastern Christendom, but the West, Western Christendom, of course, was transformed by the effects of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th and 17th centuries. Many would say that really is what's responsible for setting things in motion for where we are today. In fact, it's even been suggested that a fourth turning point in the history of the West can be seen in the rise of what's called nominalism, a kind of scholastic or post-scholastic intellectual movement of theology in the Roman Catholic Church that arose in the 14th century and played itself out in the 15th century. Those are four options, and all four do, in fact, explain where we are today in a Christian culture that is in disintegration. However, I would say, and I think today as we talk about AD 1054 and AD 2054, look forward to it, I would say that we ought to give serious consideration to another turning point. In fact, the one that I think is most important, and that is indeed the Great Schism. And what I would like to do is consider the historical disintegration of Western Christian culture from the point of view of the first millennium. Very few historians have tried to do this. Almost all historians who talk about the history of the West do so from a second millennium Western perspective. And as an Orthodox Christian, I would like to see it from a first millennium Eastern perspective, the history of the West from an Eastern perspective, and one that brings attention to how things were in the first millennium. And so in the little time that's still left to me, I would just like to bring attention to a few examples of how we can see the first millennium culture grounded in an authentic Christianity that united both the East and the West, a Christianity to which both the Orthodox Church today and the Roman Catholic Church today looks back with love and with respect. Even Protestant Christians, in many cases, do so as well. To do that, I would like to bring attention to what was a phenomenon in the first millennium, and that is that the West was very influenced by what we would call today the East. the Latin Christendom in Italy and Western Europe and in England and in places like this was influenced by the Greek Christianity of that time, which was part of the West, part of Christendom as a whole. And if we do this, we see that there was, especially found in the East, but also documented in the West as well, an understanding of the human condition that was very positive, very affirmative, and very joyful. And I think it's the loss of this affirmative anthropology, this optimism about the human condition, that was lost in the West as a result of the Great Schism over time. And it's the loss of this affirmative or optimistic theological anthropology that we can bring our attention to and see how progressively it was subverted, and that subversion of it resulted in some of the problems, perhaps a lot of the problems that arose in the course of the second millennium. So to do that, let me take us back to that first millennium and to a very important Greek father of the early church, united East and West. And this is Maximus the Confessor, a 7th century father who had his origins in the East. He was affiliated with St. Sophronios of Jerusalem. St. Sophronios wrote, by the way, composed a beautiful service of the blessing of water at Theophany, known in the West as Epiphany, on January 6th of every year, where the Jordan River, where Jesus was baptized, was blessed in a ceremonial and even sacramental way with the order that St. Sophronios introduced. It celebrated the transformation of the world through the presence, the incarnational presence of God in this world. But Maximus, learning from Sophronios, made his way all around Christendom, East and West. He had a foot, as it were, in the Greek East, and a foot, as it were, in the Latin West. In the latter case, he actually contributed to the formation, organization of the Lateran Council of 649. 649, the Lateran Council, which was an early effort to combat and fight a Eastern, Greek, you might call it, heresy called monothelitism, which subverted the doctrines that traditional Christianity held about the person of Christ. And by subverting the doctrine of the person of Christ, subverted our doctrine about man as well, the man, the humanity that Christ took on himself. Maximus did a lot of heroic things and ended his life as a confessor, having his tongue cut out and his right hand chopped off, because he taught orthodoxy, that is to say, orthodoxy recognized East and West, both in the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church today. He taught doctrinal integrity in the face of resistance by the Byzantine emperors and those theologians they had assembled around them to advance this heresy of monothelitism. Well, what Maximus said about the human condition was quite beautiful and is centered upon the doctrine known as deification. Let me read here an example, a short statement by a theologian, Maximus, who's very hard to quote, very hard even to read and understand. He's a very complicated writer, but this quote perhaps gives us a sense of how he presented the ancient doctrine of the deification of the human being in Christ. Because of the incarnation and through the sacramental life of the church, the human being is elevated to a status of great, indescribable beauty. And this is what he wrote. Man is the image of God, and he becomes God by deification. He becomes God by deification. That's a very bold thing for Maximus to say, but it was said as a result of the incarnation and the doctrine as it took hold in the early church. Maximos continues, he rejoices to the full abandoning of all that is his by nature, because the grace of the Spirit triumphs in him, and because manifestly God alone is acting in him. Thus God and those worthy of God possess in all things one and the same energy, or rather, this common energy is the energy of God alone, since he communicates himself wholly to those who are wholly worthy. This is Maximus the Confessor speaking about deification. Now, deification as a doctrine was much more prominent in the Greek East than in the Latin West, but it was also found in the Latin West, especially under the influence of the East. There was a time during that first millennium when the West was Eastern, during about 2 centuries, for instance. The popes were from places like the Greek East or Syria or Palestine. People like Pope Gregory the Great, recognized both as Orthodox and Roman Catholic as a saint. He spent his time in Constantinople in his early years, studying the Byzantine Divine Liturgy and participating in the Greek East. There are many examples of this, of the sharing of liturgical and sacramental life that came from Constantinople to Rome and parts of the West. So Maximus and his doctrine of deification built right into that Western Council, the Lateran Council in Rome itself in 649, which he helped organize, was to be found in the West. However, the Great Schism, and here we can come to the Great Schism severed the union between East and West, and the influence of that Greek East in its place in Western Christendom and culture, so that we can find a couple of centuries after the schism a growing departure from this glorified vision of the human being. In the case, for instance, of Pope Innocent III. Pope Innocent III ruled around the year 1200, and he wrote a document, a treatise, just before he became Pope, called On the Misery of the Human Condition. It was called On Contempt for the World, a subtitle, On the Misery of the Human Condition. This is what Pope Innocent III wrote in his treatise before becoming Pope. And of course, as Pope, he ruled in a very influential way in a process known as the Reformation of the Church, of the Roman Catholic Church, this long before the Protestant Reformation. This is what Pope Innocent III wrote. Man has been formed of dust, clay, ashes, and a thing more vile, a filthy sperm. Man has been conceived in the desire of the flesh, in the heat of sensual lust, in the foul stench of wantonness. He was born to labor, to fear, to suffer, and most miserable of all, to death. His evil doings offend God, offend his neighbor, offend himself. He defiles his good name, contaminates his person, violates his conscience through his shameful acts. His vanity prompts him to neglect what is most important, most necessary, and most useful. Accordingly, he is destined to become the fuel of the everlasting, eternally painful hellfire, the food of voracious, consuming worms. His destiny is to be a putrid mass that eternally emits a most horrible stench. Well, this is quite a statement, and I don't think we should see it as a one-off, a kind of exception to that earlier and glorified anthropology that Maximus witnessed to. As a matter of fact, the misery of the human condition, the treatise by Pope Innocent III, what I've just quoted, became something of a so-called medieval bestseller. It was widely copied and distributed throughout the West, partly because, of course, Pope Innocent III was such an influential figure in the Reformation of the Roman Catholic Church during this time. As a result of this new anthropology, this pessimistic anthropology, this very negative anthropology, which this is just a glimpse of, we see that in the West, after the Great Schism and the loss of contact with this earlier first millennium anthropology, we see the rise and expansion of images, especially of images and treatises that denigrate the human condition and bring attention to its misery. I will, if I may, I hope I can do this, share here my screen with everyone, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pull this off. Let's see. Yes, I can do that. This is the creation of Adam. And it shows, but it was done by Greek Byzantine iconographers brought from the Greek East to the Latin West. And it shows Christ here on the left-hand side creating Adam here naked in paradise. What I want to bring attention to are the faces. You see, the faces are the same. It's a really beautiful expression, visual expression, iconographical expression of the doctrine at the heart of this deification we just heard Maximo speak of, that man is the image of God, image of God. And so Christ, the Logos, who's the creator of the cosmos, the Son of God, creates Adam in his own image. And you can see this represented in the faces here. But if we move forward beyond this to the period, the so-called period of the Middle Ages, after the Great Schism, and under the influence of writers like Innocent III, we come across images like this. So this is the Dance of Death. I think now you can see it. I want to contrast this with, if you've ever seen the interior of the famous church of Saint Apollinaire Nuovo in Ravenna, Italy, built under Justinian in the 6th century, also in Italy. You'll see a line of saints on either side of the basilica, oriented toward the altar as they move in procession, as it were, toward the kingdom of heaven. Humanity deified through communion with God, sacramentally within the liturgical life of the church. Well, here, the procession is away from the altar. You can't really tell with the image, but this is a westward, not an eastward movement. It's a, you might say, disorientation. If orientation means facing east, and it does, of course, this is a disorientation away from the east, which the altar would be over here. This is the side of the church here, the side of the interior of the church here. It's called the Dance of Death, and it's a reflection on death. And if I can show you just here's a blow up of it, you can see everyone being led by these skeletal figures to their death. And now this, of course, is a perfectly legitimate image, reminding people of their mortality, something that Pope Innocent had so wanted to do. But what's interesting is the reflection now is no longer on the glory of man's communion with God in the liturgical temple, but on the misery of the human condition and on death. So what happens in this period after the Great Schism is a growing pessimism about the human condition. That pessimism in a culture like Christendom, Western Christendom, could not sustain itself very long, because Christianity, after all, is anything but pessimistic. It's about the transformation of the human being in Christ and the glorification of the human condition in that state. And so we get the Renaissance as a reaction against this pessimism, and we can look at the Renaissance as an alternative view of man's condition. Here, I hope you can see now the creation of Adam, represented by the famous Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel of Rome. Here, a Zeus-like God. Michelangelo now represents God as a old man with a gray beard. Never before really was God represented as Father. He was only represented as the incarnate Christ. God had no human form. The Father had no human form and was not iconographically represented that way. And with his barrel chest, very much modeled on the Zeus of pagan mythology, and iconography, he touches the hand of a limp Adam, who himself looks very physical. And the emphasis is now on the physical and natural beauty of the human being, rather than the spiritual beauty of the human being in the Renaissance and what follows during the course of the so-called Enlightenment. And so, if I may, I will return to my pictures here to show you some of those images. We go from here's an image of the Virgin Mary. This is Raphael's Madonna of the Pinks. You see a glorified humanity here in Jesus and also in the Virgin Mary, but it's a humanity without any reference really whatsoever to the doctrine of deification or the incarnation. Of course, this is the incarnation. We know that this is Jesus just born of the Virgin, who is right here, but nowhere in the icon are we told that this is what's going on. Really, it's just a reflection on the beauty of a young woman and her baby, lost in their own moment together, rather than liturgically rendered as an icon before which a Christian would come into the temple and pray, and through prayer and sacramental communion, achieve deification. Now Jesus is represented in a naked form to celebrate his natural beauty, but with his nakedness, he becomes impossible to pray to. And this image by Raphael, the Madonna of the Pinks from the Renaissance, is a good example of the rebellion against that negative, pessimistic anthropology articulated by Innocent III and represented in images like the Dance of Death. If we continue with this history, and I know I'm out of time or running out of time quickly here, and I want to honor that, if we continue in the history of the West, we eventually move from the Madonna or the Virgin to Venus. By the 18th century, painters like this is the French painter Boucher, begin painting a female beauty no longer as the Virgin Mary, but as the Greek goddess Venus, to celebrate the physical beauty of the human being. In this rebellion against Christian anthropology, which to them seemed in its medieval form after the Great Schism so negative, they go much further in a non-Christian tradition now and abandon Christianity and its imagery altogether. And if I may, I will end things here with this 20th century image, which in the wake of Nietzsche and other nihilistic expressions of a rebellion against Christianity altogether, and even the optimistic and utopian and secular humanity celebrated in the Renaissance and especially in the Enlightenment, now you have the total disintegration of the human being. This is Picasso's Woman Weeping. And here you see the actual disintegration of the human form altogether in a 20th century that brought forth communism, Nazism, and secular progressivism, and which brings us up to the current moment when we don't know as a culture any longer whether the human being is worthy at all, or even in many cases what a human being is. And I will, I think, end things here. I could give a few more quotes. I had some Nietzsche to quote to you, but I think I'd better let that go because I see time has gone away from me here. And so I will leave it there, but with one final reminder of what George Florovsky said in the 20th century, having witnessed this whole history in his own way. He said, history may be a tragedy, but for a Christian, it's always a creative tragedy. And I do hope that as we move forward toward 2054, to commemorate, sadly, the Great Schism after one full millennium, we can recover some of that deep past from the first millennium before there was a Great Schism. Thank you.